For most of modern history, inequality was treated like bad weather, unpleasant, sometimes dangerous, but ultimately natural, something markets would eventually smooth out, something economic growth would fix, something not worth worrying about, as long as the overall economy kept expanding. Then one economist did something deceptively simple. He stopped looking at decades and started looking at centuries. Welcome to Financial Historian, where money, power, and history collide, and nothing is ever as simple as it seems. This is a story of Thomas Piketty and how his work quietly dismantled one of the most comfortable assumptions in modern economics, that capitalism naturally spreads wealth over time. This isn't a story about ideology. It's not about left versus right. It's about what happens when you follow the data long enough that the usual explanations stop working. For most of the 20th century, mainstream economics focused on growth, productivity, output, efficiency. The assumption was simple. If the economic pie kept growing, eventually everyone would get a bigger slice. Inequality, if it appeared at all, was treated as temporary, a phase of development, a side effect of progress, or simply a measurement problem that would correct itself. And for a while, history seemed to support that belief. After World War II, inequality dropped sharply across much of Europe and the United States. Wages rose. The middle class expanded. Home ownership spread. Wealth concentration declined. Economists looked at this period and quietly assumed it was normal, the natural outcome of advanced capitalism doing what it does best. But that assumption depended on a very short memory. Piketty's insight wasn't ideological. It was archival. Instead of starting with theory, he started with records, tax archives, estate data, income statistics, national accounts, not just from one country, not just from one decade, but across multiple nations, stretching back hundreds of years. When he stitched all that data together, a very different picture emerged. The post-war period wasn't the rule. It was the exception. For most of modern history, wealth had been far more concentrated than economists like to admit. The 19th century, the world of Jane Austen novels and industrial expansion, was an era of rising opportunity. It was a world dominated by inherited fortunes, a world where owning capital mattered far more than working for income. The sharp decline in inequality after 1914 didn't happen because markets suddenly became fair. It happened because capital was destroyed. Wars wiped out fortunes. Inflation erased debts. Taxes rose dramatically. Governments intervened on a massive scale. Equality didn't arrive politely. It arrived violently. And once those forces faded, inequality began doing what it had always done. It started rising again. This is where Piketty asked a question that made many economists uncomfortable. Why does wealth tend to concentrate over time, even in democratic, market-based societies? Not as a moral question, as a mechanical one. To answer it, Piketty made a crucial distinction, one that sounds obvious once you hear it, but changes everything once you think it through. He separated labor from capital. Labor is what you earn from working. Wages, salaries, income tied directly to effort and time. Capital is what you own. Assets that generate income simply by existing. Land, housing, stocks, businesses, bonds. And at the center of the system lies a quiet asymmetry. Labor has limits. You can only work so many hours. You can only increase productivity so quickly. Your income grows slowly, if it grows at all. Capital doesn't face those limits. Capital compounds. It doesn't need to work harder next year. It doesn't need to retrain, negotiate, or show up on time. It simply grows. This is where Piketty introduced the idea that would define his work, often simplified into a slogan and often misunderstood. When the return on capital consistently exceeds the growth rate of the economy, wealth accumulated in the past grows faster than income earned in the present. It sounds technical, but the reality is simple. If you already own assets, your wealth tends to grow faster than the economy itself. If you don't, you're trying to catch something that's accelerating away from you. This isn't a conspiracy. It's arithmetic. And over long periods of time, arithmetic wins. Piketty showed this dynamic repeatedly across countries and across centuries. Before the 20th century, inherited wealth dominated economic life. After the shocks of war and policy intervention, inequality temporarily fell. But as growth slowed and capital recovered, the old pattern returned. The data didn't suggest a temporary glitch. It suggested a tendency. And that's why his work hit so hard when Capital in the 21st Century was published, because it quietly challenged one of the most powerful stories modern societies tell themselves. That inequality mainly reflects effort, talent, or merit, and that markets naturally reward contribution more than ownership. Piketty wasn't arguing that markets don't create wealth. He showed something more unsettling. Markets are extremely good at preserving and amplifying existing wealth, especially when economic growth slows. When growth is high, wages can rise alongside capital. But when growth slows, capital keeps speaking, and labor gets quieter. This is where the real-world consequences appear. Rising housing prices benefit owners, not renters. Stock market booms reward those who already hold assets. Inheritance becomes more important when wealth compounds faster than income. Opportunity becomes less about talent and more about timing. Specifically, whether you were born before or after assets became expensive, compound interest doesn't care how hard you work. This is also why Piketty unsettled people across the political spectrum. Critics argued his view was too pessimistic, too deterministic. Surely innovation, new industries, and entrepreneurship would disrupt old fortunes. And sometimes they do. But Piketty's point wasn't that mobility is impossible. It was that, at the system level, those disruptions rarely cancel out the underlying trend. Exceptional success stories don't define average outcomes. Supporters saw something different, a long-term map of how money and power evolve over time, and how easily comforting narratives form when we only study short periods. If you only study the post-war boom, inequality looks solved. But if you zoom out, it looks structural. And that may be the most important lesson of Piketty's work. Zoom out far enough, and inequality stops looking like a failure of individuals. It starts looking like a feature of how capital behaves when left to itself. What made his work explosive wasn't just what it revealed. It was when it appeared. Capital in the 21st Century was published in 2013, at a moment when inequality was no longer abstract. Asset prices were soaring. Wages were stagnating. Central banks had flooded financial markets with liquidity, and yet the dominant narrative still insisted the system was fundamentally fair. That opportunity was alive. That effort would be rewarded. That what people were seeing was temporary. Piketty didn't attack that story directly. He simply extended the timeline. And suddenly, the narrative looked very different, because when you zoom out far enough, patterns appear that short-term stories conveniently hide. And one of those patterns is deeply uncomfortable. Long periods of equality are rare. When you zoom out far enough, something unsettling begins to appear. You start to see that wealth concentration is not a historical accident. It isn't a rare anomaly. It's a recurring pattern. Across countries, across centuries, across entirely different political systems. The details change. The technologies evolve. The institutions shift. But the pattern itself keeps returning. And when you examine the moments when inequality actually falls, another pattern appears, one that is far less comforting. Because historically, the forces that reduce inequality are rarely smooth or gradual. They aren't gentle market corrections. They are shocks, wars that destroy fortunes, inflation that erodes debts and savings, taxation imposed at extraordinary scale, political upheavals that rewrite economic rules overnight. In other words, inequality didn't decline in the middle of the 20th century because capitalism suddenly matured into a fairer system. It declined because capital itself took a hit. Factories were destroyed. Financial assets collapsed. Entire economic hierarchies were disrupted. The playing field wasn't gradually leveled. It was violently reset. And once those extraordinary forces faded, something familiar began to happen. The old pattern quietly returned. Wealth started concentrating again. This reframing collided directly with the way modern societies prefer to think about themselves. Because if inequality is structural, if it's built into mechanics of how capital behaves, then it can't simply be blamed on a few irresponsible bankers, corrupt politicians, or unlucky policy mistakes. It becomes something deeper, something systemic. It becomes a question of how the financial system distributes rewards over time. And that realization opens a set of uncomfortable questions. Questions many institutions would rather avoid. Who benefits when asset prices rise faster than wages? Who gains when economic growth slows, but returns on capital remain strong? Who is protected when wealth compounds year after year? And who is left exposed? Piketty never claimed to have easy answers to these questions. In fact, that wasn't his goal. What he offered instead was something closer to a diagnostic tool, a long-term X-ray of how money behaves when it accumulates. And like any honest diagnostic, the results weren't particularly reassuring. That's why the backlash was immediate. Critics argued that Piketty underestimated the power of innovation. They insisted that technological change constantly disrupts old fortunes. New industries appear. Old companies collapse. Entrepreneurs rise from nowhere. Surely these forces will continually reset the economic hierarchy. Others pushed a different argument. Even if wealth concentrated at the top, they said individuals could still move upward. Social mobility, they argued, mattered more than static inequality. As long as people had the chance to climb the ladder, the distribution at any single moment didn't matter as much. And to be fair, these objections weren't trivial. Innovation does reshape economies. Mobility does exist. New wealth is created all the time. But Piketty's research suggested something more difficult to accept. At the level of the entire system, these forces rarely outweigh the long-term power of compounding capital. Individual success stories can be dramatic, but they don't necessarily change the average outcome. And averages, when measured across centuries, reveal something persistent. When the return on assets remains high while overall economic growth slows, a pattern common in mature economies. Wealth slowly drifts away from labor. Ownership begins to matter more than contribution. Timing begins to matter more than effort. This is the point where Piketty's work stops feeling abstract and starts becoming practical. Because once you understand this dynamic, many modern economic puzzles suddenly begin to make sense. Why housing becomes increasingly unaffordable even when economies continue to grow. Why stock markets can reach record highs while wages barely move. Why inheritance begins to play a larger role in determining life outcomes. Why financial security increasingly depends on asset ownership rather than career progression. In a low-growth world, capital doesn't need extraordinary opportunities to win. It simply needs patience. Time does most of the work. This dynamic also explains something that often confuses public debates: the strange role of inflation. Inflation is usually framed as a universal problem, something that erodes everyone's purchasing power equally. But in reality, inflation affects different forms of wealth very differently. Cash loses value quickly. Wages often lag behind rising prices. But assets, real estate, stocks, businesses frequently rise alongside inflation or even faster. So in certain environments, inflation doesn't simply redistribute wealth randomly. It can quietly amplify existing inequalities. The numbers on paper might look stable. Economic indicators may suggest recovery. But beneath the surface, purchasing power is slowly shifting upward, from those who depend primarily on income to those who already hold assets. In these moments, the financial system isn't malfunctioning. It's behaving exactly as its incentives encourage. And this is where misunderstanding Piketty becomes genuinely dangerous. Too often his work is reduced to a moral argument, as if he were simply declaring that inequality is bad and should be eliminated. That interpretation completely misses the point. His real contribution was analytical, not moral. He showed that inequality has a natural tendency to persist, unless something actively pushes against it. Markets are extremely efficient at allocating returns to ownership, but they are not designed to distribute outcomes evenly over time. Understanding that fact doesn't automatically force someone into a particular political ideology, but it does fundamentally change how you think about risk, opportunity, and financial security. Because if wealth tends to concentrate, then financial education can't simply focus on discipline or budgeting. It has to include a deeper understanding of assets, how they grow, how they compound, and how long-term financial structures shape outcomes more powerfully than short-term effort. This is a quiet reason Piketty's work matters. He shifted the conversation away from a moral debate about inequality toward a structural explanation of how inequality reproduces itself. And once you understand that mechanism, you start asking different questions. Not just, how hard should I work? But, what do I actually own? Not just, is the economy growing? But, who captures that growth? Not just, is the system fair? But, what does the system naturally do over time? History may not repeat itself exactly, but capital, it turns out, has habits. And one of its strongest habits is accumulation. Left uninterrupted, wealth tends to gather where it already exists, not because of conspiracy, not because of deliberate design, but because compounding rewards existing ownership faster than new income can catch up. Piketty never argued that this outcome was morally inevitable. He argued that it was mechanically likely. Interruptions can happen, policies can shift, technological revolutions can reshape entire industries. Economic shocks can redraw financial maps, but none of those forces occur automatically, and none of them appear simply because markets decide to be generous. That's the grounding insight this episode leaves behind. Understanding inequality isn't about resentment. It isn't about ideology. It's about realism. It's about seeing the financial system clearly enough to navigate it without illusions. Because if you mistake a structural tendency for a temporary phase, you don't just misunderstand history, you misunderstand risk itself. And in finance, misunderstanding risk is often the most expensive mistake of all. If this perspective changed the way you think about money and power, consider subscribing, because history already contains the answers. You just have to know where to look.